Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Thy Strong Word. I'm Pastor A.J. Espinosa. We're reading the entire Bible together out loud, chapter by chapter, and right now, book by book, as we go through like the whole span of the Bible here. We're going all the way from Genesis all the way into the New Testament here. And so we're looking at this really big hinge moment today and yesterday. Yesterday with Pastor David Boisclair talking about 2 Chronicles 36 and the destruction and downfall of Judah and Jerusalem and the temple. Today in Nehemiah chapter 6 now, we're picking it up and looking at, okay, so what do you do with the ruins and the rubble and trying to rebuild? And you see actually here that Nehemiah, it's a really just a cool story. It's just one of these many stories, I think, in the Bible where there's a conspiracy, there's a plot, there's all these people getting together and trying to cause the harm and plot the downfall of God's people, but God just flips the script. He turns it around on him. That's what we got for us today. Joining us as our guest, we've got Pastor Doug Nicely, pastor at Jerusalem Lutheran Church in Collinsville, Illinois. For some reason, I always say this, that your church's name just feels very appropriate to whatever we're reading. I mean, it's probably going to happen a lot, but it feels very appropriate today.
It does. I don't know if I had told you this before, but do you know Pastor Jerry Juris, who worked with the CTCR for a long time?
Maybe. Go on.
He's an old friend. At any rate, he did some research after he went to our church as a mission speaker one time and found out that we are the only Jerusalem Lutheran Church in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod.
Is that right?
Yeah. Isn't that strange?
That is surprising. Yeah, no, I mean, it's it's a fairly common word in the Bible. You'd think that more than one, well, maybe we shouldn't name every single one St. Paul's and Trinity.
That's right.
I mean, those are good names, but they don't all have to be named that.
No, they don't.
But anyways, welcome back, brother. Good to have you. And yeah, this is a neat story, and
it is.
Well, it's one that I don't know why it's not more well known. It's just really cool stuff.
I think after the Babylonian exile, it's like everybody quit studying because it was all depressing.
Yeah.
But this is a, as you said, this is a bright shining moment in the midst of a lot of darkness.
Yeah.
And it's been a while now since we took a look yesterday at 2 Chronicles 26. It's been
that's right. A lot of things have happened.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that in just a moment I'll ask if you can try to maybe kind of bridge the gap for us, and because there is, I mean, this is, as you were saying, a part of the history where it's kind of fuzzy to us because we do sometimes just say, and Jerusalem just was destroyed, and then it was like, and then Jesus. Well, there's a few centuries at least.
Yes.
But before we get there in just a second, would you, brother, open us up with a word of prayer?
Sir. Lord, we thank you for the opportunity to be able to study your word, and maybe especially those places where we normally don't read or don't study or intentionally pay that much attention. What an opportunity this is for us, the way we're studying the word and in this program, to be able to cover those books and those chapters that we might have missed before. Help us to learn something new, and, of course, to apply the lessons learned in Nehemiah to our lives today. We pray in Jesus, the Savior's name. Amen.
Amen. All right. So, so last time we talked about, I mean, and it felt like it was kind of going fast, too. We talked about all these different kings, and we saw how some of them didn't last for much longer than 3 months or so. Right. But things really quickly, there's this back and forth between Egypt and Assyria and then Babylon. But now, here in Nehemiah, we're not even dealing with Babylon. This was what we got at the very tail end of 2 Chronicles 36. Persia rolls onto the scene. So, right. Catch us up. What's going on? How do we get to Nehemiah chapter 6?
Well, there came a time when the Babylonian Empire itself fell. There was an interesting reference in Isaiah, which was written a couple of hundred years before it started. And Isaiah specifically names a king named Cyrus, king of Persia, in Isaiah 45. And he talks about how this king of Persia was going to send the children of Israel back home again from exile, which he did. This is a prophecy in Isaiah, but what always impresses me is that he names the name of the man who's going to do it, and he says, "Even though you do not acknowledge me." He used this ruler to do that. So he's the king of Persia. When we're living in the world of Nehemiah and the book before it, Ezra, we're still living with the rulership in the land of Persia, but this is quite a bit down the road, perhaps as much as 200 years after Isaiah wrote, and maybe about 100 years after the time of Jeremiah, who actually saw what you studied yesterday in First Chronicles 36 or Second Chronicles 36.
Right, so and actually it was mentioned there at the end of Second Chronicles 36. There was, I think, if I recall, there was an allusion to Jeremiah's prophecy about the 70 years, right? And that's the same prophecy that gets mentioned in Daniel. There's this well-known, there's going to be this 70 years, and it's not until that time is up that we're actually going to have this comeback. To use the Advent language, this time when you get a little shoot coming up from the stump, right? It was going to wait for 70 years to happen here, and so you get that, as you were saying, with the decree of Cyrus, takes over. So now he is king of Babylon and everything to the east, in the Persian Empire, and his policy is a little bit different. He says, I think we talked about this before. I think it was like last week, that there's kind of a good cop, bad cop thing, and so it's really nice and easy for Persia to come on and play good cop here. And say like, the Babylonians, those guys, they were so mean. But hey, look, we'll send you back to your Holy Land. We'll give you materials to rebuild your temple. We'll give you materials so you can build it twice as tall as it was before. We'll give you stuff for sacrifices, right? So they seem to be extremely supportive, right, in this role now, saying like, hey, look, just stick with us, pay your taxes, right? Well, I mean, hey, we're not so bad compared to those guys. But it's not all just peachy and rosy here, right? I mean, like, you've got some people who are these adversaries, these opponents here that we're dealing with in Nehemiah.
I get the impression when we get to chapter 6, because we had mentioned also we're going to stop off and visit a little while in chapter 2.
Yeah.
But I get the impression in chapter 6 that when we're dealing with the people named Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem, that these were Canaanites, probably living in Samaria. And I would imagine they're living in Samaria because that was a very important city in those days, because there was nothing left in Jerusalem. And the people who came back from exile, if you read in Ezra, just kind of lost steam and just quit doing stuff, which is what the circumstance is behind the story of Nehemiah. They were back from exile after the 70 years, but they just didn't have any way of being able to rehab the city, and had no idea how to do it and where to do it, and that's why we need a Nehemiah. That's why we need an Ezra, the book before.
Absolutely. It's and it's something that I think that probably in some ways, well, I think there's different, we can talk about this, there's different moments in more recent history where it kind of feels like this, where everything's been decimated and you're just kind of like, okay, now what do we do? There's no instruction manual on this, right? Maybe that's like, the LCMS, the early LCMS, right? When it gets over here to America and they're like, okay, now what do we do? Now what do we do? Right? And maybe even there are some ways in which even more recently than that, we might relate to this. But yeah, let's just go ahead and Yeah, we'll give this a read through, like you said. Nehemiah chapter 2, the first 6 verses in there do a nice job of giving us a little bit of context.
Yes.
So we'll read that little bit, and then I'll just hop right over to chapter 6, and we'll just kind of take it from there. So here's the first 6 verses of Nehemiah chapter 2, and then proceeding on to chapter 6. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now, I had not been sad in his presence, and the king said to me, "Why is your face sad, seeing you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of the heart." Then I was very much afraid. I said to the king, "Let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad, when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" Then the king said to me, "What are you requesting?" So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it." And the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, "How long will you be gone, and when will you return?" So it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time.
All right.
And then chapter 6 then, so that just kind of sets us up. That there's Nehemiah introducing things. And then we get this in chapter 6. Now, when Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem the Arab and the rest of our enemies heard that I had built the wall and that there was no breach left in it, although up to that time I had not set up the doors and the gates, Sanballat and Geshem said to me, saying, "Come and let us meet together at Hekapirim in the plain of Ono." But they intended to do me harm. And I sent messengers to them, saying, "I am doing a great work, and I cannot come down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and come down to you?" And they sent to me 4 times in this way, and I answered them in the same manner. In the same way, Sanballat for the 5th time sent his servant to me with an open letter in his hand. In it was written, "It is reported among the nations," and Geshem also says it, "that you and the Jews intend to rebel. That is why you are building the wall, and according to these reports, you wish to become their king. And you have also set up the prophets to proclaim concerning you in Jerusalem, there is a king in Judah. And now the king will hear of these reports. So now come, and let us take counsel together." Then I sent to him, saying, "No such things as you say have been done, for you are inventing them out of your own mind. For they all wanted to frighten us, thinking their hands will drop from the work and it will not be done. But now, O God, strengthen my hands." Now, when I went into the house of Shemaiah, the son of Delaiah, son of Mehetabel, who was confined to his home, he said to me, "Let us meet together in the house of God within the temple. Let us close the doors of the temple, for they are coming to kill you. They are coming to kill you by night." But I said, "Should such a man as I run away? And what man such as I could go into the temple and live? I will not go in." And I understood and saw that God had not sent him, but he had pronounced the prophecy against me, because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. For this purpose he was hired, that I should be afraid and act in this way in sin, and so they could give me a bad name in order to taunt me. Remember Tobiah and Sanballat, O my God, according to these things that they did, and also the prophetess Noadiah and the rest of the prophets who wanted to make me afraid. So the wall was finished on the 25th day of the month of Elul in 52 days. And when all our enemies heard of it, all the nations around us were afraid and fell greatly in their own esteem, for they perceived that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. Moreover, in those days the nobles of Judah sent many letters to Tobiah, and Tobiah's letters came to them. For many in Judah were bound by oath to him, because he was the son-in-law of Shechaniah, the son of Arah, and his son Jehohanan had taken the daughter of Meshullam, the son of Berechiah, as his wife. Also they spoke of his good deeds in my presence, and reported my words to him, and Tobiah sent letters to make me afraid.
Quite a crew to be opposed to.
Yeah, right. I mean, it goes on and on. Like, he's just got enemies all around, people with friends in high places, right? But he does not take the bait.
No. Now, I think the context once again here is that these people who were opposed to him were probably people who have been used to being in charge for the last century or more, and with somebody coming in and rebuilding the ruined city of Jerusalem, that was a threat to their power and their authority. You know, they had worked with the Persians well enough to have the Persians give them the right to be able to be in charge, and they realized that if Nehemiah would continue his work, that they wouldn't be in charge anymore, and that was why they became his opponents.
Right. So you get this, so back in Persia, right? You've got Artaxerxes. He's the big fish, right? He's the big king of the mountain, right? But over here, right, in the little kid sandbox, there's these little hills, right? these little mounds, and these are the guys in the schoolyard who are used to being in charge of these little smaller domains. They're and so when Nehemiah comes in here, starts building a wall. And the thing is, I think we kind of don't get that, but maybe you could elucidate that for us. What's the big deal about building a wall? And what is it about that makes them afraid of losing influence?
There are different reasons for building walls. If we can remember from more recent history, there was a wall that was built in China that was supposed to keep opponents away from them. There was a wall that was built in Berlin to keep East Germany and West Germany separated. And the idea in each of those cases was to distance the people who would come to their cities or come to their territories away from them so they could keep them distanced from them. The building of the wall in Jerusalem was of a different sort. Right. The idea behind it was to be able to set up a defense place, a defense boundary where the people who, like Sanballat and Tobiah, might decide to come and invade. Well, it would be very difficult to do that when they have to go over a wall in order to get into the city. And so just remembering a little thing that happened to me in one of my earlier jobs, one of the things that I did several years ago was being a hospital chaplain. And the president of the hospital came up with what I considered to be a crisis every year. Sometimes he had to kind of invent one, but he had a crisis every year. It might have been the creditors coming in to work with the hospital, but the idea behind the crisis was that we would circle our wagons and we would defend ourselves against the aggressors. It worked. It gave you the impression from the administration that they liked you and they supported you, and they did several things during the course of the year to be able to show that support of the staff. I appreciated that. I realized it was a bit of a game, but it was a good game in that way because it gave us a chance to all be on the same team. That's what the wall was all about.
Yeah, that's interesting.
On the same team.
Yeah, well, and it's a helpful illustration. I think that's spot on. That we can't think of it like the Great Wall of China or like the wall separating East and West Germany in Berlin, right? Like this is not like a national border wall, right? That's supposed to separate two countries. This is a wall that goes around a city, and it's really the thing that makes a city, right? Until you have a wall, it doesn't really. It's just kind of a town, right? It's just sort of it's just kind of another place where people sleep when they're done working, right? But when you have a wall, it becomes a real city, and I think that like in your illustration, like where you were saying there's kind of like a crisis, kind of like constantly going on, basically. I mean, that's how it was, right? Like if you didn't have a wall, you were vulnerable to just raiders, and that was like their occupation. It was just they came, they raided, and they'd come all the time, probably much more often than once a year, even. So until you go ahead.
And it was very possible for this to happen because what we seem to forget is that the territory of Israel is very small geographically.
Right.
The territory of Israel is roughly the equivalent of the entire Chicago metropolitan area. All of Israel.
Right. Well,
that's amazing.
So it's a large population in a small place, right?
Right.
And if you're going to have that large population, like you were saying, coordinate, be on the same team. If you're going to have any kind of center of cultural influence where you could coordinate or even proclaim that you have your own king, for example, as they accuse in chapter 6, right? Like you need to have some kind of like capital base of operations with a wall. I mean, like it's just it's essential. So I think that kind of really helps us understand that this wall is kind of basically like refounding Judah as its own entity. And until you have the wall, you can't even do that. So you can see why politically, like you're saying, these guys feel like their turf is getting stepped on a little bit.
Yeah, and they get the impression, especially putting up the wall, because they already tried to oppose putting up the wall in chapter 4 of Nehemiah. And they even made fun of it, saying, this isn't going to work.
Right.
But, the problem was that it was working. And that's why Sanballat and Tobiah got to be so pushy when it came to trying to get Nehemiah to do what they wanted him to do.
So taking a quick step back, looking back at chapter 2, then.
Oh yeah, it's good stuff.
What do you think about like the boldness here of Nehemiah's request and a couple different moments? I mean, it's interesting. I think being afraid is a big theme in the part that we read in chapter 2 and then also throughout chapter 6. The question is, like, who are you going to be afraid of and what are you afraid of, right? And the enemies are trying to intimidate him and get him to be afraid. Here in chapter 2, he just admits he is afraid of the king. So what's he afraid of here, though? And what's the tension here while he's making this request? And I mean, it even mentions that the queen is there, right? It's like what do we make of all this stuff?
Let me run a couple of biblical parallels. In fact, these aren't just remote things. These are almost contemporary to the time of Nehemiah. There are stories in the book of Daniel and stories in the book of Esther about what happens when somebody approaches the throne of a king. Right. And if the king decides that he does not want to pay any attention to somebody, Esther's a good example of that, his wife could have been killed for trying to come into his presence.
Yeah.
So it was a scary thing to do that. Now, we get the impression that Nehemiah was King Artaxerxes' butler. So he was doing his job. Mm-hmm. But apparently King Artaxerxes realized that he was that there was something about him that was different. He looked like he was almost sick. And I think what we have going on here inside of Nehemiah, and what a good story Nehemiah is. Nehemiah, I think, was involved in borrowing a little bit from a theme from Daniel, in what one of my Bible tour guides, John Goldingay, calls an arrow prayer. An arrow prayer is a specific prayer. I know my wife sometimes, when she was out for lunch for an hour, needed to stop off at stores and stuff like that, and she prayed for a place right next to the front door of the grocery store. That's an arrow prayer. Well, what he's doing, that might have been silly, but I think that's exactly what Nehemiah is doing. He's praying that he would have the opportunity to speak to the king in this way, and the king allowed him to do that. And he was wise enough to say what was on his heart instead of just making some sort of appropriate request. Because he knew that the request would not be honored if it wasn't from his heart.
Well, and I think that I like that term, arrow prayer. I mean, the thing is about an arrow prayer, right? If you're going to be going and you're going to say, I'm going for it, I'm shooting for the bullseye, right? I mean, it's that there's boldness to it, right? it kind of reminds me like you do like I don't know, like mini golf, and at the very end it's like you can go for like the thing with the best score at the end, but there's usually like little like crocodiles and castles and moats around it, right?
Right.
So you can't just take the safer route that just gets a low, not as good of a score, but it's safer, right? But he's going for it. So there's this boldness, and we got to talk about the boldness of Nehemiah. But it's time for our break. Everybody, we're going to be right back here looking at Nehemiah on Thy Strong Word. Be right back.
In 2020, the world was blindsided. At the Lutheran Church Extension Fund, we quickly refocused on how to best serve the church. Our COVID-19 response team took action, reaching out and listening to our borrowers. In response, we offered a number of financial remedies that allowed our borrowers time to stabilize. We also provided online streaming kits for churches, gift cards for food pantries, financial support for LCMS church workers, and much more. Life's not yet back to normal, and that's why we're still here for you. Visit lcef.org to learn more.
How do I keep my kids in church? Will there still be a church for them to go to? New people have moved into my neighborhood. How do I reach out to them?
Our challenges are many, but it is Jesus who makes disciples for life through his church. Let's come together as the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod to discuss this joyful work. Learn more about the Making Disciples for Life initiative at lcms.org/makingdisciples. Again, that's lcms.org/makingdisciples.
Did you know that your individual retirement account may make the best gift to KFUO? The IRS now allows individuals 70 and a half or older to transfer their required minimum distribution directly to charity and avoid paying the associated income tax. These gifts can provide regular, long-term resources to KFUO. If you have questions about making an IRA gift to KFUO, call me, Mary, at 314-996-1518. We'll send a representative out to help answer your questions and help you establish a legacy of giving to your favorite radio station, worldwide KFUO.
Welcome back, everybody, to Thy Strong Word. I'm Pastor A.J. Espinosa. We're looking at Nehemiah today, a little bit of chapter 2 and focusing here on chapter 6, talking about fear and boldness. The boldness here of Nehemiah making this request, just going for it here. He's got the opportunity with the king, and he says, "All right, we're just going all in. We're just gonna go ahead and just make the request." There's a few things that are pretty ironic about it, especially for a man such as Nehemiah to be so bold as to make that request. We're joined today by Pastor Doug Nicely, pastor at Jerusalem Lutheran Church, the only Jerusalem Lutheran Church in the LCMS in Collinsville, Illinois. If you've got a question for us, give us a call if you're listening live, 1-800-730-2727, or if you're in St. Louis, 314-821-0850. You can also send an email to kfuo@kfuo.org. Got a couple of questions here. Kind of looking at this, so I guess this is an interesting question that's worth considering here. Mm-hmm. What biblical worldview about the coming Messiah did the Persianized noblemen and priestly elite have during Ezra and Nehemiah's time? Was it the same as ours? And related to that here, are we in a period of spiritual enslavement to the civil, political, and cultural powers of our day as the Persian serfs residing in this satrapy during Ezra and Nehemiah's time? I love any word related to satrap, and especially satrapy. So those are good questions. Thinking about how did the Persians influence the people of God here, and you see some influence in just in the way that actually Nehemiah talks, which is worth talking about as we consider. I mean, this is the balance, right? People talk about contextualizing the gospel and being missional and being incarnational, but there's also being assimilated and living among and then just becoming the Canaanites, right? So it's a tightrope. We'll get to that in just one second. I just wanted to also just mention we do have also if you have any questions, you can hop on Facebook.com/AJ Espinosa. I got some questions there we can also talk about in just a minute. I want to thank our underwriters at the Lutheran Heritage Foundation, lhfmissions.org, a good website to check out afterwards. Those are our underwriters. Thank you guys for supporting Thy Strong Word. Mm-hmm. All right. So, yeah, brother, as we're looking at this here, and you were saying, so, yeah, he is bold, and he's just going to go for it here. It's really interesting because I think that a lot of the details here do point to Nehemiah being Persianized in a couple different ways. And you mentioned one of them, that it was really something in the ancient world for another man to be allowed in the presence, well, first of all, in the king's presence, like have an audience with the king like that in close quarters, but to be in the presence of his queen. And that is one of the hints that a lot of scholars have used to say and to deduce that Nehemiah was a eunuch, that this was a standard practice in the Persian court. It's the only reason why he would have been allowed to be near the king and the queen together like this. And so you have here not simply just the king's cupbearer, but the king's eunuch. And this is pretty interesting, pretty bold for the eunuch to be going after this request and saying, yeah, I want to go and rebuild Jerusalem. What do you make of that?
That was a bold request. Once again, borrowing that term, that's an obvious indication of his arrow prayer. Yeah, he's really trying his hardest to do what it is that he has prayed for. Now, all of us have our ways of doing arrow prayers, but what he really wanted to do was we wanted to accomplish what apparently wasn't being accomplished back in his home territory. And remember, if you're dealing with living in Persia, you're 1,000 miles away from Jerusalem. So all this had to be hearsay, and he just felt as though he wanted to be in that role. Because he felt as though he was the one that God had chosen to do this. Now, being chosen by God does not necessarily mean that you have a right amount of years of education or an appropriate amount of income. He just had this on his heart, and that's what he was doing. Had the king not decided to agree, it would have been nothing.
Well, and to your point about status too, from a Hebrew perspective, it wasn't a plus that he's a eunuch.
No.
This is something that in the Old Testament, it's something that makes you unclean. So just forget about participating in a lot of the important parts and moments of the Hebrew community life, like worship life in the people of God.
We'll see that in chapter 6.
Exactly, right. And this would account for why he's refusing to go in the temple. He's like, no, I can't do it. Right.
Well, plus he wasn't a priest.
Right. No, that's right. So, I mean, you do have there are moments where you can lay your hands, not necessarily like in the. There's different levels, of course, of being in the temple, right? But lots of people could be in the temple courtyard. People who are seeking sanctuary could grip the horns of the altar, things like that. But that's not an option that's available to him because of this uncleanness. It is pretty interesting. We could talk more about that, but there's some interesting stuff about how the word for eunuch and the word for cupbearer, like they're super close, but we don't have time to get into that. But just the idea of, he's not the kind of guy that Judah necessarily even wants as a leader.
No.
It doesn't even make sense to have him be a king because he can't have a son. I mean, so like for all these things, it's really something for this guy who, I mean, he doesn't have a lot going on. He doesn't necessarily even have the support and favor of his countrymen. Like you're saying, he's out in Susa. He doesn't know what's going on, and he just goes for it. Though there is a boldness of faith here.
Ezra probably had better credentials because he was a priest.
Yeah.
But it seems after you get finished reading Ezra, that things weren't going well when he was there either. He was there first. And Ezra does show up in the book of Nehemiah. But it really seems as though Nehemiah becomes the governor of Judah when he goes back again. And that's one of the reasons why he does what he does. The Persians were kind of interesting. Once again, that's the note you got. Once again, take a look at Isaiah chapter 45, and you can see very clearly, and this is a prophecy, I understand, but let me quote to you once again. He says, "I am the Lord, there is no other. Besides me, there is no God. I equip you, though you do not know me." That people may know from the rising of the sun from the west that there is no one beside me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. So the impression we get from the Scriptures, and from Isaiah's prophecy specifically, is that the Persians were being used by God to accomplish the purpose of his kingdom, even though they had no idea that they were following the Lord's agenda, nor that they were following the Lord.
Yeah, well, and that reminds me of when we were talking about, it was back in, I think, what was it, First Kings, maybe? But when we were talking about Elijah and just how, God's commanding the widow to feed him, and she doesn't even know what's going on at first, right? He commands the birds to sustain him. It's not like the birds were like, "Yes, sir," and we're like, "Okay, guys, we're going to go, Operation Feed Elijah here." No, I mean, God's commanding everyone and everything, all things. What, like you said, like whether you know it or not. I mean, that's from a modern perspective. That's what we refer to as, in some ways, just law. Like we talk about like natural law. We talk about like laws of human behavior. I mean, it's the glue, it's the order, right, that holds everything together, is God directing things. And so just look at how providential this is. And I see Paul on Facebook. Yeah, you're thinking the same thing I'm thinking. Look how providential this is, that the eunuch here works up the courage to make this request, because he's actually now a better choice for Artaxerxes to have go down and be governor, because he cannot have a son, and because he is ceremonially unclean, and he's not going to like have the support of the people that like rallies around him and makes him into a kingly figure. No one's going to say like, "Oh, look, this is the Messiah." No. So it really is just amazing how this works out, and there's this boldness. And he just goes for it, and it's hard, because it's interesting how it says, he wants to rebuild this, and then in chapter 6,
the conspirators will take that same line of reasoning and twist it around and use it as what should we say?
That's
tweet?
Right. Yeah, I know, right? Yeah, so they're just tweeting this stuff out, and it's like this is a really easy way for the disinformation campaign to just catch on here, because it's true. The people of Judah are rebellious people, and in fact, this is part of the problem when you look at Ezra, especially, right? They did rebel against Assyria and rebel, you could say, like against Egypt, and they were two-timing people, and rebelled against. I mean, so you have all these different moments, and so they're going to be able to kind of just drag this stuff and say like, "Hey, look, do you really want to be giving your support, O Emperor, to these rebellious Judahites?" Yeah. Well, we got a call here. We got James on the phone. James, good morning,
Hi,
brother.
James.
Always good to hear from you.
Good to hear you again, Pastor Nicely. I always enjoy
James,
when you come on the Bible studies.
James, I'm happy to be able to put you on my list to receive my emails every day.
And they're such a blessing to me and my family. Thank you so very much for that.
You're most welcome.
And brother, moderator.
Yes, sir.
I like to
Pastor AJ.
AJ, I'm sorry. I'd like to parse these two questions between the both of you guys.
Okay.
And I want to give you the first one that I sent in, AJ, because I'm looking at these Persianized noble and priestly elite, and how in chapter 5, the righteous indignation that Nehemiah had because of their behavior towards their kinsmen. Mm-hmm. And in Ezra, they didn't want the Samaritans around them to help them build. Is this the beginning of like a Pharisaic mind? And if you can kind of answer that question in the context of, are they trying to have an axe to grind against Nehemiah because of his righteous indignation and rebuke of them in chapter 5, verses 6 through 8?
Okay. Yeah, good question.
And for Pastor Nicely, I heard you talking about Isaiah chapter 45. Mm-hmm. Why was King Cyrus of Persia called the anointed of Yahweh in Isaiah chapter 45? Okay. And how significant is the return of the exiles to our eschatological understanding today?
Okay.
And I'll hang up and listen.
Thank you, James.
Yeah, thanks, James. Yeah, really, really good questions as always. So taking that first one here, this is a good question to be asking because, okay, he's got, enemies all around, Nehemiah does. So, hey, if the, if some of the people in the north are going to ask and say, hey, we can help you out, why don't we just, we'll get on this together, right? So why wouldn't he take some allies, right? Like, why would he say like, oh, no, we're doing this ourselves? Yeah, so you could, I can see how you can line that up, right, with like, say, like the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? Mm-hmm. And you could say like, oh, look, here they are just being really, like, hey, we're just going to take our ball and play over here. And, this is kind of that kind of self-righteousness, right, in the bad sense. I can see that, but I'm actually not inclined to be so hard on them. And I'm thinking about some Old Testament parallels. The two that come to mind immediately, and these are ones that I think we've talked about. One, you have Abraham buying the grave for his wife and for the family plot. And then later, you've got David acquiring that piece of territory there in Jebus for the altar of God, which would then become the focal point and the center piece of the temple there in Jebus or later Jerusalem. And in both of those instances, there is an offer on the table that those would be given to them as gifts. And they say, no, I can't take it. I'm not taking your money. I'm not taking this gift. I'm buying it. Here's my money, right? And so you think, well, why is that? Is this pride? Like why can't? Well, you got to stop and you got to understand the ancient notions of gift giving, because, and this is something that actually goes on to this day. Actually, a number of traditional cultures. The thing that I don't know. This is just an interesting illustration to me. If you give someone, say, an animal, like some kind of a field animal, and that animal reproduces, right, has offspring. In these cultures, you like have to give back some of the offspring from this given animal, this gift animal, to the person who gave it to you. Now you would say, now hang on a second, why is that? It's a gift. They gave it, right? Like, that's not really a gift if you expect something in return. Well, that's not how it works though in these cultures. There's always the sense if you're given something, that person has a stake in it. They have a claim on it. Like it's inseparable because it's an extension of them. So
it's like
I think when you look at it in those,
because I gave it to you.
Well, it's almost like because you didn't buy it from me, it's still part of me, and it would just be disrespectful to act like, like I've got nothing to do with it, right? Like disrespectful in the sense of like, I don't know what, pretending that a son has nothing to do with his father, right? If it's from them, like there's a connection that's undeniable. And so I think that when you look at the request, then Nehemiah is like, hey, look, no, we're not going to have the Samaritans help us out, because then what's going to happen later? They're going to say, hey, we helped you build the temple, right? We helped you build the wall. well, don't we have some share in this? And like, shouldn't we be able to put our altar in there? And shouldn't we be able to, like, here's some of the stuff that we're doing up here in Samaria, right? Here's some of the worship that we did on Mount Gerizim. So I see it actually as a really legitimate move in this culture that he needs to say, no, look, we're doing this ourselves because we're doing this for Yahweh and the way that we know in Jerusalem. And even the Lord Jesus himself said to the Samaritan woman, we worship what we know, whereas you do not know what you worship.
And the financial connection usually can complicate a relationship. In the New Testament, St. Paul says that's exactly why I didn't receive any money from you Corinthians.
Yep, good.
Because I didn't want you to rule over me. Mm-hmm. And that didn't mean he was supposed to have authority and they didn't. He was just saying that, because you didn't pay me, that means that you have no control over me.
That's right.
In the same way.
They don't have a stake in it. They don't have a share in it. He hasn't to surrender any of that authority.
And you can see that with Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem in chapter 6 of Nehemiah. Mm-hmm. That's what they're trying to do. Yep. They're trying to exercise their influence.
Exactly. So if you can't beat them, join them, right? But Nehemiah sees through that too. Like, that's going to be the backdoor way that they end up defeating this whole project, because it won't be a city of God. It'll be a city of all the stuff that they're involved with. Great question, James. The other question that he had directed for you, brother, was regarding. What was it in particular?
Cyrus, king of Persia, in
that's right,
Isaiah
the anointed. Yeah.
Well, the word anointed, we could translate Messiah, which sounds pretty heavy duty. But another way of translating it would be chosen. That God has chosen Cyrus to do this. Now, Cyrus is doing this not necessarily because he is a Messiah, not in the sense that we understand Jesus is the Messiah, but what he was doing was he was accomplishing God's will on earth as it was in heaven. And that was, as I mentioned before, despite the fact that he did not know God nor acknowledge him. But yet God used what Cyrus decided. I keep telling people, I get the impression from the books of the Bible that specifically talk about this, that Cyrus came to Babylon after he conquered it, was looking around, and he said, "Who are all these people?" And they said, "They're Jews." And he said, "Where do they come from?" And they said, "They come from 1,000 miles away from here, and the Babylonians took them here in captivity 70 years ago." And Cyrus said, "Send them home." That was it.
Yeah.
That was his anointed purpose to accomplish that.
Well, and we know too from extra biblical sources that this was the policy that he had in general. That he did this not just for the Israelites, but for lots of people,
for all sorts of nations, right? So once again,
makes it all the more remarkable, really.
So once again, he would be considered to be a more generous and gracious ruler than the Babylonians had been. There could be a personal agenda behind what Cyrus was doing.
Sure.
But the point here that we have in Isaiah's prophecy, remember Isaiah's writing this over 100 years before it happened. But the point here is that God used, even if Cyrus was just trying to play a political game with the leftover loyalty for the people from Babylon, even though he was trying to do that, God used it to accomplish sending people back home again from exile. That was God's purpose. That's why he was anointed. Not that he was God's servant for anything other than that one task.
That's right. That's right. Well, and so it makes it, well, I mean, and you see the same thing, I think, in Esther as well, just how, I mean, he ends up using the very gallows, right, that was meant for Mordecai, right, to actually Well, spoiler alert there, right? But I mean, this is what happens, right? God is using everyone, like you were saying, everyone in their agendas and their plots and their plans, and says, all right, you want to do that? Well, it's still going to serve my purpose in the end. And so you have a really, I think, in the Persian period with these texts like Nehemiah and Esther, just a really strong sense of God just being over all things, and even when it looks like someone else is in control. Well, I mean, there's the irony, right? Like in verse 7, where they're coming at him in Nehemiah, and they're saying, "Hey, look, you're sending up these prophets to say, there is a king in Judah, and we're going to send these reports back to Persia unless you come over here and talk to us, right? Unless we can straighten this out." And there you have it. Like there's this sense that, well, no, actually, God is the king, and God's the king even if Persia's in charge, even if Artaxerxes, is the one who's nominally in control. I mean, and this goes back to, so just to scroll up just for a second here, but and we've seen this before too when we looked at the book of Daniel. But when Nehemiah prays there. In chapter 2, what's he say? He says, "I prayed to the God of heaven," and you see this as this is the way, like in Ezra and Nehemiah and Daniel, that God gets referred to. It's the way that the Persians talked about God. But it's like, you know what? That's okay. That's okay that it's your term, because you know what? It works for us too, and we know that our God is in charge of even all the stuff that you guys have. I mean, so there really is just a boldness there to act and to say, I'm the eunuch of the king of Persia, right? I don't have standing. Everything about me is just screaming Gentile Persian. But you know what? I'm not going to let it stop me, because I know who's really in control.
So let me do a little bit of a summary about Nehemiah.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Nehemiah, we get the impression, is a true servant in every way, shape, and form. He did not receive the income he was supposed to have. We get the impression that from the earlier chapters that he didn't have good food to eat because he was the governor. In fact, we get the impression that he took his turn when the building of the wall, standing there and watching, for all the Canaanites. So you had to have a sword in one hand and building tools in the other.
Right.
And he took his turn watching the walls, and he took his turn building the walls too. And one of the things that's so refreshing about Nehemiah is that at every point in his book, in his letter, where he's concerned about something, he turns to the Lord and prays.
Yeah,
you find it over and over again in Nehemiah.
And thank you for that summary, because it's so relatable then for us, right? Because even if we're not of the line of David, and we have power and influence, and even if we're looked down upon, and we seem to be kind of the opposite of what we think is going to win people over, or have support, there's a boldness that comes, like you said, from that relationship in prayer and knowing God's sovereignty, and that you can go for it, because it's not about you. You can leave your pride behind and say it doesn't matter. I know who's in charge. And
instead, just pray arrow prayers. That's our word for the day.
Yeah, I like it. Thank you so much, brother. I've enjoyed our conversations. I'm taking arrow prayers with me here for our conversation today. God bless you and the people in Jerusalem.
And God bless you and your good folks in California.
Thank you, brother. Everybody, that was Pastor Doug Nicely, pastor at Jerusalem Lutheran Church in Collinsville, Illinois. All right, next time we are going to go on to that one more Old Testament book we got to take a look at before we go into the New Testament next week. We're going to be looking at Esther. All right, so look, I mean, it's just, we already talked about it a little bit today, but just how God is in control of everything, even when God's name is never mentioned. Until next time, I'm Pastor A.J. Espinosa. Peace.
You've been listening to Thy Strong Word, produced by the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod Office of National Mission in cooperation with Worldwide KFUO, the official broadcast ministry of the LCMS. Your support is vital for this program to continue. You can make a gift safe, secure, and easily online at kfuo.org. Thank you for listening and supporting Thy Strong Word.